Hello everyone and welcome back to the interview. I'm your host, Susan Lee MacDonald. Folktales and legends exist in every single culture all around the world, and Korea is no different. Korea has some incredible stories that have been told for thousands of years, and people now around the world are getting a chance to experience what those amazing Korean stories are. Today, I'll have an amazing chance to meet American illustrator and writer Anne Sibley O'Brien. She has spent so much time here in Korea in the 60s and 70s and has a unique perspective of Korean culture where she shares with her drawings and books and her life. I hope that you really enjoyed today's episode of the interview, and let's go meet Anne. American writer and illustrator Anne Sibley O'Brien has garnered attention from the media and the public and won numerous awards in children's literature. And the book that turned her into a star writer overnight? Anne, who believed that the wisdom of life and universal truth can be discovered in Korean folktales, published an illustrated book in English that was adapted from the Tale of Hong Kil-dong, and it caused a sensation in the world of children's literature in America. She first came to Korea with her family in the 60s when she was just 7 years old, and grew to love this country as her own. She uses her talent as a writer and illustrator to bridge the gap between Korea and America. Anne Sibley O'Brien's story of promoting Korean folktales through her adapted works and adopting a child from her second home, Korea, begins right now. Anne, I'd like to welcome you to the interview. It's such a pleasure to meet with you.
Thank you so much.
And welcome back to Korea.
Thank you.
You've been practically, living in Korea like on and off for quite some time.
Yes.
And I'm just curious what brings you here this time to Korea.
This time was a very special trip. My father passed away a year ago in June. It's almost exactly a year. So the family decided that we wanted to bring some of his ashes back to Gyeonggi-do, to the island where we had a community health project. And then also the Daegu Hospital, Dongsan Hospital, where he was a surgeon, requested that they be included. And so we had a kind of a memorial service for several days, and also
honoring his life, and
honoring
all the
his
work
life
that he's done here.
Yeah, and reunion with staff and extended family and friends.
Wow. How has it been since you've been back? Has it been kind of difficult for you? I mean, it's not necessarily a celebration of sorts,
right?
But maybe in a way celebrating your father's life.
Yes, absolutely. My dad was 85 and he was very ready to go. So it seemed like a completion of his life to come here. So it's been mostly joyous. I've had pangs, fierce pangs of missing him occasionally, but it's really been a celebration.
As someone who's not only Western but also lived here, you've straddled both cultures for some time.
Yes.
And what a great person to be able to tell foreigners about Korea.
Sometimes it helps, I think, to have an outsider's perspective. It's a mirror that can reflect back to Koreans what's so wonderful about Korean culture and people, and then also someone who's between can sometimes interpret in a way that makes it easier for people who aren't Korean to see.
Definitely. And I'd really like to just kind of get into how you have written about Hong Gil-dong. Legendary fable of Korea. Was it a fable? Is it really based on a real story? Who
was
really
a real
knows?
guy?
But you've basically helped a lot of Americans and people in North America know about Hong Gil-dong.
I was down in Cambridge at Harvard at the Yenjing Library, which has the largest collection of Asian literature in the continental United States.
I love that library.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
And they have an entire section that's in English translation, that's all Korean. So I was browsing there around the time that I was working on a Korean folktale, The Princess and the Beggar, Pabondar.
Okay.
Well, and I found a collection, an anthology of Korean literature that was published by the University of Hawaii. And I was looking through it, and there was the Tale of Hong Kil-dong in English, an exact translation of Hugyun's novel. And I was astonished, first of all, because I hadn't realized it was a novel. I thought it was a folktale. But here was the entire work that was written around 1600. And I, reading through it, I knew the basic idea. You know, I knew that there was magic and adventure and taekwondo, and it wasn't taekwondo then, but and so I immediately was attracted to the idea of doing it because I thought kids would love this. I mean, he can fly.
When someone translates some type of story from one language to another, without some cultural background and understanding and context, it must be a little bit difficult to convey certain kinds of stories.
Yes.
And I'm curious if you ever encountered some of that with doing the Hong Gil-dong story, and what type of changes did you make?
Yes, there were just a couple of things. Well, there was the big picture, which is the story was written for adults in the 1600s about the 1400s, traditional Joseon Dynasty Korea. And so my audience was now young Americans, contemporary, in contemporary times. So obviously a lot of the cultural information that would have been understood would not make any sense or be of interest. So what I did was kind of go and pull out the skeleton of the action story, the plot that really moved fast. I cut quite a bit to make it more spare. And there's only one change I made. Which was the original novel in Hugyun's writing says when the assassin comes to kill him, that the assassin that's been hired by his father's mistress, who's jealous of him, and it says that he heard the bird cry 3 times, and he knew that, okay, it's nighttime, a bird's crying, that something's off. So using his knowledge of magic, he turned himself invisible. However, there's no mention of magic up until that point. So if from an American perspective, it's like, you can't do that. You can't suddenly get magic. So I asked all my Korean friends, so how does he know magic? And to a person, they said, oh, he went up into the mountains and he met a master and he trained with him. And I said, that's not in the book. And they said, oh yeah, it's in there. I said, no, I have it. It's not in there. But for some reason, maybe of the times, people just kind of assumed this. So I added that one scene where he goes into the mountains and meets the master. And yeah. It's because otherwise it just was not going to fly, that all of a sudden he knew how to do magic. One other thing I really want to be clear about is that I could not possibly have done this by myself. I got enormous assistance from the folks at the Yenjing Library who helped me with resources. They pointed me in the direction of, they had the books, and then they helped me, and then I kept going back, and they would pore over every detail. And the last time when I had the complete line drawings, the final line drawings, before I did the color, I happened to go at a time when there were two guys from a museum here in Seoul visiting, and they also stopped everything and sat down for about an hour or 2 and pored over every line, every detail, and we had these long discussions about when he should have straw shoes and when they should turn to silk shoes or the other way, and whether or not the candelabra was too ornate. It was fantastic.
Well, it sounds like you've just been able to bring a lot of people who would be definitely like amazing help to your book.
Yes, and I couldn't have done it without that expertise. I didn't have, despite all my Korean experience, I needed a lot of help.
Children's stories cultivate imagination and creativity for children, while for adults, they restore childlike innocence and bring back fond memories from their childhood.
영은 언제나 날아갈 때 구름 속에 있지. 그래서 그 한국 사진 보면 이렇게 구름에 있지. 그래서 이 용 몸은 이렇게 가고 이렇게 가고 이렇게 가지. 그리고 이 몸은
There are valuable lessons to be learned from children's stories, and Anne Sibley O'Brien shares the morals of Korean folktales with children around the world.
Scales, fish scales. 뭐라고? 그 물고기처럼.
비늘.
비늘. 잘했어. 그죠?
Through
They
her
look great.
adaptations of Korean folktales, Anne has instilled hopes and dreams in children and passed on life's wisdom to teach them how to cope with problems.
How did you decide to craft this for an American audience?
I think this is a world-class story. I think it has universal themes and content that I can't imagine a person who couldn't connect with this somehow. The fatherless boy, well, he has a father, but he can't claim him. The questions of identity, why am I here? The struggles.
Very philosophical.
Very much so,
Yeah.
and in a sense, he's bullied. Everybody's teasing him, and he's trying to figure out how he, who am I that I'm shunned and rejected and marginalized by everyone, and from that he makes greatness. I just get chills saying that. You know, it's an extraordinary story, and then in terms of Korean culture, I cannot think of another piece that's more of a window into Korean culture, because you have King Sejong, who, if you were going to choose one Korean figure to share Korean culture, it's got to be him. And then you have Hong Gil.
Definitely.
Because the wonderful thing about this story is, as far as anybody knows, it is the first piece of Korean literature that was written in Hangul,
Yes.
150 years after Sejong developed the alphabet. So it's absolutely the epicenter of Korean culture.
And how was it received in the States?
It's really been remarkable. Sometimes when I'm standing in front of a classroom of, say, 4th grade American kids, none of whom has any contact to Korea, probably doesn't know where it is, and I realize I'm explaining to them 1400s Korean history and talking about the Korean alphabet, and they're riveted. And I think it's because the story is so rich,
Yes.
and it's so exciting. All kinds of great stuff happens. So,
Absolutely.
so that's the key, I think. But it has. I got more awards for this book than any other. One of the awards that's particularly interesting is I got the Aesop Award, which is for folktales.
Yes.
So that was really cool, because you think that it's obviously a European-based, mostly European-based team of judges, I would think,
Yes.
who recognize the value of what the book offered. So the critical reception has been really, really wonderful. It's been really wonderful because to have a vehicle to talk about it. Growing up, I had the experience so many times when I'd meet Westerners, and especially like in the States, and people would say, like, where are you from? And I'd say, well, I'm from Korea. And the conversation stops. People have no context. They don't know
Yes.
how to, like, what's the next question? And very often they don't have any interest. So to have this passion, and also to have this part of me that doesn't show, that's so key to my identity. And now here's this vehicle that I can walk around with, and this is part of who I am. And yet it's in a form that will attract a non-Korean audience
Definitely.
too. And then the other thing that's really fun is to do it when there are Korean children present, and they either don't know the Hong Gil-dong story because they've grown up in the States, or they do know it and they feel that they've got a spotlight on them for when normally they might be in the shadows, and that's really fun too.
The first novel written in Hangul, The Tale of Hong Kil-dong. The hero of the story, Hong Gil-dong, is described as having mastered various skills, including martial arts, as well as the art of transformation and invisibility. As a way to overcome the restrictions resulting from his social status, Hong Gil-dong decides to become a bandit and steal from the rich to help the poor. The Tale of Hong Kil-dong teaches the readers to be kind, understanding, and righteous. This legendary tale drew attention in America thanks to Anne Sibley O'Brien's illustrated book in English titled The Legend of Hong Gil-dong, the Robin Hood of Korea.
how did you get to first encounter Korean folktales?
Well, The Princess and the Beggar was a favorite of mine because it was the first movie that I ever saw.
Really?
I think I was 8 years old and got taken to a Korean theater, and I have not sharp but important memories of some of the images. So that one really stayed in my heart. But my very first introduction was through a book that my parents had that was published by Tuttle in the 50s. And as on our way to Korea, the very first time in 1960, we had this book of Korean folktales. So that was kind of my first introduction to Korean culture as we were on the way.
Your first project was The Tiger and the Persimmon, and I'm curious why you chose that particular story as your first project.
I had just taken a class in children's book illustrating and writing. So during that class, I chose a project to start to work on, and I thought, well, what can I do that maybe other people can't do? And I chose that book, and I used it to learn the structure of a picture book, how you put a picture book together. I didn't know anything. So I still have those early, they're called dummies, the mock-up, the model, and they're pretty funny because there's no way it was going to get published.
So with your telling of the Korean folktales, what is really appealing about it? What is the driver behind why you feel you need to tell these stories?
The Korean folktales have an earthiness to them. I think that's they're very something about Korean culture that's comes out of nature and people who are living close to the ground somehow. It's very much about how people live every day, common emotions. There's usually lots of drama, and it's a wonderful way to share Korean culture without it being didactic. Just in the flow of the story, people can learn.
Yes, I find that while the stories are really universal, it always has some type of a moral, ethical kind of tale.
Well, one thing I'm thinking of when I consider a lot of them, and even Hong Gil-dong, all those characters, they're very humble. They're people who try to do the right thing, even though at the time it might be hard, and it might cause more difficulty for them. And in the end, they win. But they're not puffed up at all. They're not pretentious. They're very people of good character and people who are earnest and well-meaning and kind. So it's really good virtues that they're showcasing.
Definitely. In doing the illustrations for a lot of the books that you've been doing, I imagine that there are a lot of old-time Korean words that are very difficult for even modern Koreans to know. It's like Shakespearean English or Old English that we're trying to translate into now. How did you kind of get around and understand the meanings of some of these words to make it not only for a Korean audience but for a Western audience?
I don't think I always succeeded. There were times when I would make a choice to say something that would work for an American audience, and I was really clear that I didn't really understand the nuances of the word. But I was always using translations, English translations. So I wasn't working from the Korean alone, which I could not do. I don't have those skills. I was standing on the foundation that the translator had already built by figuring out what those words meant. But yes, it's a real challenge.
I imagine. But despite those challenges, you have been able to communicate the essence of the stories so well through the paintings and through the storyline. And I think that one of the things that I find really fascinating about your artwork is that it's almost more Korean than what Koreans have done. I mean, I grew up in Korea partially too, and I've seen a lot of different comics and illustrations, and I would never have guessed, had I not seen the name on the front, that it was done by a Westerner.
That makes me so happy. Yeah. I've had that comment a lot, and Korean American friends often said, you know, you're more Korean than I am. I think that's the experience of someone who comes in from the outside and falls in love when it's your own, it's so easy to take it for granted.
Yes.
And then of course Korean artists have interest in other things that not necessarily only their own culture.
Sure.
So it that comes through because I'm admiring it from within and also from the outside.
To have the artistic and creative skills to be able to portray that is really something special.
It is. A bicultural identity, as you know, is a treasure. It's challenging because people who aren't bicultural have really no idea what it's like to be torn between two places, two people, two ways of being in the world. But there's so much richness.
Yes.
And I think those of us that are always caught between also have the gift of being able to be a bridge.
Absolutely.
And that is wonderfully a way to be insightful about both.
A lot of the books that you've illustrated have gotten global attention. And I'm curious, why do you think that out of a lot of the books and illustrations that are out there that you've gotten a lion's share of the spotlight of
I don't know about that.
of the Korean
Oh,
legends and the books?
For me, the passion is about showing the beauty and glory of human diversity. And when people look at my books, I think that they can tell I love these faces that I'm painting, that they can feel that love.
Yes, yes. There's some type of sense of respect of each of the characters that you draw, that there's a real intent to just show them as they are. And I think that a lot of people who read and look through your books really feel that. Do you think that it's possible for the literary world to give more attention to Korean folktales going forward?
I think it's essential. Not just folktales, but all of Korean culture and also contemporary Korea. On Saturday, 2 weeks ago, I went to the Makgeolli Hakgyo. There's something to give the world.
Oh, wow.
What a fabulous drink and history and tradition there, and the elegance of shared drinking that's not about getting drunk, but about appreciating life. There are so many things about Korea that I wish, if I had one message to give Korean people, it would be that you have world-class treasures that the world is waiting to hear about. Some are beginning to happen, like Daejangum and other the dramas are getting out, and people are beginning to see.
Sure.
But kimchi, apparently this is the year of fermentation, so kimchi
Really?
will really take off.
Interesting.
Yeah. Hangul is a marvel. Lee Sun-chin, the story of Lee Sun-chin, I've heard people say he's the world's greatest admiral. That kind of content is, it's not just particular to Korea, although it's absolutely, it's Korean only. Nobody else has this, but it's also universal.
Yes.
Anne Sibley O'Brien has been promoting Korean culture through her books, including The Legend of Hong Gil-dong, The Robin Hood of Korea, A Special Day, and The Princess and the Beggar. But her interest doesn't solely lie in Korean folktales. Search her name on America's largest online bookstore, and it will retrieve some 30 books to which she has contributed. She has not only written and illustrated her own adaptations of Korean folktales, but also illustrated numerous other books, such as After Gandhi. Through these books, she has taught her young readers the notion of human rights and won the National Education Association Author-Illustrator Human and Civil Rights Award.
I'd love to ask you about your upbringing and how it was that you came to Korea back in the day.
Back in the day. In 1960, my parents fulfilled lifelong dreams that they each had separately and then together to live and work overseas. When they were accepted as medical missionaries with the Presbyterian Church, and we moved to Seoul in March of 1960. My dad was a doctor, a surgeon, and they did a year of language school in Seoul, and then we moved to Daegu to work at Dongsan Hospital.
I see. And did you have a lot of siblings as well?
Yes, there were 4 of us. I don't know how my mother did it.
Oh, wow.
But she brought 4 children ages 9, 7, 5, and 2 to Korea. I know.
Wow.
I was the 7-year-old, and so then Korea gradually became our second home.
So did you find yourself going between the U.S. and Korea in your early childhood, or did you stay here most of the time?
We stayed here from 1960 to 64, and then there was a 2-year furlough. And then we were here for another 5 years with just a summer. And all of that had to do with my father's training and other resources that he needed to continue to do work here in Korea.
What are some of the things that your father helped with, you know, surgically speaking? Was he integrated into a regular Korean hospital?
He was a surgeon at Dongsan Hospital on staff with a group of Korean surgeons. And then he began to do work at the newly opened leprosarium. He was doing reconstruction surgery for people who had had leprosy and been cured, but then they had like drooping faces, no ability to smile. And he was figuring out how to do that.
Wow.
And then the thing, so he was working in the context of a mission hospital that was kind of the cutting edge at that time for medical care.
And you mentioned this hospital. Where did you live when you first came to Korea?
When we first got here, when my parents were in Seoul for language school, they put us in one of the mission houses. And those were turn-of-the-century brick houses built in Western style on compounds, on hills surrounded by walls. And it wasn't my parents' idea of how they wanted to live. So they petitioned the mission, and eventually, after 2 years, we were able to move in a Korean home, which looked a little like this.
Oh.
And
so it seems a little familiar
very,
to you, yeah?
very familiar. Not quite the scale, but the porch reminds me so much, and the concrete blocks that where we took our shoes off was exactly like this. So I feel very at home. And that changed everything in our relationships. And I consider the reason that I'm bicultural, truly bicultural, is because of the decision that my parents made that they wanted to be with Koreans, not separated from them.
You also had a chance to live in a very remote island in Korea, the Jeoje Island.
Yes.
And what was that like? And at that time, I imagine that it was more than rural.
Yes, that's a good way to put it.
Just native
completely, completely out of reach almost. It was an island, especially the northern part where we were, was farmers and fishermen, no paved roads, no electricity, very rural, and also very poor. We were actually invited there. My dad came up with this idea that although the hospital care was important, most Korean people, especially people without financial resource, were not getting reached. And so he came up with an idea for a community health project and a demonstration project, and that's why we moved to Jeoje.
Okay. I imagine in the 1960s that Westerners here were a very big minority, a rather small minority. And I'm curious what types of things you might have faced being so different looking than everyone else here.
It was the center of the experience, really. It was like walking around with a spotlight on us all the time. In particular, because I'm extroverted and I was lighter in complexion and hair, I got a lot of attention constantly. I became accustomed to being a spectacle. Sometimes going down to the market, we'd literally have a crowd of, several deep of people just, 어머나, 얘 봐라, 아유, 큰 눈, 고쟁이, 머리 큰 머리야. So there was a quality of awe.
Did you find it difficult to adjust to being in Korea at any point?
I don't remember that. I'm sure that there were losses. I was 7, so I had had many experiences in the States, and that had all been taken. But my parents framed the whole thing as a big family adventure. And, kids take their cues from their parents. So I remember it as being wonderful. There were, and exciting and adventurous. There were moments when things were challenging, smells or tastes. I remember one thing, when right after we got here, my parents very much wanted to experience Korean food. So they got someone to arrange for us to go out into the country and have a traditional meal made by a farmer's family.
Oh, nice.
And we walked into a room like this, and it was laid out, long table, and all these beautiful things. And I love color. And the first thing I saw was this beautiful, bright red dish. So I took a big bite of kimchi.
Oh, yum.
And then I didn't eat kimchi for about 10 years after that.
Was that traumatic for you at that time?
shock 먹었어요. But now I love kimchi. I can't get enough of it.
Back in the 1960s and 70s, Korea looked very different than it does now.
Yes.
And I imagine that there's a bit of a culture shock as people return to Korea after not having been here for some time.
The things that were shocking to me when I first came back, the biggest change I saw was when I arrived in 1989, the year after the Olympics. And that seems to me the most dramatic shift. All the high-rise apartments. And then in 2000 when we came, everybody was on little hand phones, long before people in the States were. So for me, the culture shock here is not just between the old Korea that I grew up in and the new Korea, but it's between the States and here, because Korea, modern Korea, is futuristic compared to Maine.
Yes.
You know, I think our tallest building is like 10 stories. And so I'm not only comparing with how different it is from how I grew up, but also from how I live now.
And are there any special memories that you have of the people that you encountered as a child here?
Oh, more than I could possibly recount. The most abiding relationships were with our extended family, because in Korean culture, you call people by their relationship to you rather than their name, like big brother, big sister. I have many 언니 and 오빠들, and in particular, there was a core group of about 6 people who became truly extended family, who lived with us for long periods of time and cared for us and treated us like their little brothers and sisters, not like some special Americans.
Yeah.
It's just wonderful, and taught us so much. And several of them I've lost already, early. They died early, but many others are still here, and those relationships are so precious to me.
Would you mind sharing with us one of those memories?
My oppa, one of Han Jae-chul, was very, very close, and he and Dad met the first year we were here, and he came on sort of as Dad's photographer to document everything that we were learning. So we have wonderful old pictures of Korea in Korea in the 1960s that oppa took. An amazing experience was bringing our daughter, who was born in Korea, was adopted, to Seoul in 2000 for her first return home when she was 14. And we stayed with Oppa and his family in Jamsil and on the Ondol floor. And Oppa and my daughter fell in love with each other. She claimed him as her uncle, and it was so. And he was utterly delighted with her because she loved everything Korean. It was really sweet.
That sounds like an amazing time that you guys had.
It was, dear.
I imagine that every time you do come back to Korea, for those that you can meet, it must be an amazing kind of reunion and kind of healing of just not having seen them for a long time.
Absolutely. And there's a way of reclaiming that, the essence of those relationships. I was so struck this trip by how deep and real they are. They're not the relationships of people in functions. They're human, deep, loving connections. So much so that when you see the person, tears spring to your eyes. And it's easy to forget that when you're in the States because it's, a long ago memory, and to think, well, maybe it wasn't as deep as I remember, but this time I won't forget now how much it matters.
Anne came over to Korea at the age of 7 in 1960 along with her parents and siblings when her father was invited as a medical missionary. She lived in Korea for 13 years before permanently moving back to America, and she still has fond memories that she recalls every now and then. To the blue-eyed Korean Anne Sibley O'Brien, Korea is her second home.
And you've mentioned your daughter a few
Yes.
times, and I would love to know about what was the decision behind adopting a Korean child?
It was a dream of mine from the time I was 10, 11, 12 years old, when I used to go after school every day to the Children's Hospital wing of Dongsan Hospital, where they cared for the babies from the orphanages and the children. And it was a young girl's dream. You know, they have such a thing about babies often.
Yes.
And I'd walk into this one room of older babies, and there might be 10 cribs in the room, and every baby would stand up and hold their arms up to be held.
Oh.
So it was.
Oh my goodness. How did that make you feel?
Mostly at the time, I think there was a heartbreaking aspect of it, but it was mostly that I could do something because I could play with them, I could feed them, I could hold them, and the staff was very kind, but not enough people to go around, so they welcomed us there, and I used to play for hours with these babies, and I tried to get my mother to adopt all of them, but she felt that having 4 was enough already.
Sure.
And so I had to wait 25 years to bring my own Korean baby home.
Wow.
And there were several events in our lives that postponed the adoption for a little bit, but now we think it was all for a purpose because it had to be Yunny. It couldn't have been anybody else. From the moment we got her picture, we knew she was our daughter.
What did you feel when you first met Yeon-hee? What was that experience
A
like?
life highlight does not begin to describe it. We walked into the agency, and her foster mother brought her in. She was 7.5 months old. She was healthy and plump. She'd been low birth rate and very, very difficult early births, or early childhood. So we thought she might not be well, but she was just glowing and beautiful even beyond the pictures that we had seen. And she was totally relaxed with us and went to us without any fear and played and smiled. And then her foster mother took her home for the weekend so we could get over jet lag. And on Monday we went and picked her up, and I was carrying her around in the market that day, and an ajumoni who was selling food looked up at me and said, "어머나, 어머니 닮았네." My daughter looked like me.
That's so
I was so
funny.
thrilled.
Oh.
Yeah, it was just, it was such a momentous occasion and such a feeling of my life coming full circle.
Did Yeon-hee ever suffer from an identity crisis, or ever feel that she really didn't belong anywhere? I know that that's a common thing that a lot of adoptees do face, regardless of their parents' ethnicities and theirs. So, would you like to comment on that?
Yes, she certainly has had her struggles. She's never been regretful or never wished that she wasn't Korean or wasn't adopted. To my knowledge, that's not what expressed. What did get expressed was that it was really hard being the different one. She was teased she was kind of a scapegoat child for a number of years in her life, and being teased. And it wasn't actually racial. In terms of what people said, it was about, like, people would come up to her and say, "So how come your parents gave you up?" And then she would have an emotional response to that was quite intriguing. So then the person would push some more, and that's how it started, and it just took off. And that was a real serious struggle, which she did a wonderful job of gradually building up her strength to overcome. And as a result, she has extraordinary compassion for anybody who's in that position.
Yes.
But the most important thing we learned was to honor whatever she was feeling, that she didn't have to make it look good. All she had to do was move through her emotions, and she came through it beautifully. We kept her very much connected in every way that we could. We sent her to Korean language school, which she hated, and but she knew some Korean songs. She could read and write Hangul, and I had done everything I could to keep that alive for her. She finds that in Korea or in large all-Korean settings, she feels that pull of not really being Korean enough, but she loved Korea. She just, everything about it, and continues today. She cooks amazing Korean food.
What's her favorite one to cook?
I don't even, well, the one that astonishes me is, one Christmas a couple years ago, I gave her the Korean drama 대장금, Jewel of the Palace, and she watched it literally 25 times. You know, it's like 100 episodes. She's watched it over and over and over again, and it's all about food. So she got the cooking videos. She makes the royal palace food
I heard that you recently had a very special wedding for your daughter.
Yes.
And the traditional Korean wedding,
Yeah.
which is such a beautiful ceremony.
It's gorgeous.
And I know that a lot of people who do come to Korea to get married, they opt to do something like this. What was the impetus behind that?
It was Yanni's idea. She said, I want the whole traditional wedding. And the funniest thing was that I had several years before, with a Korean American friend, researched and written the pebek, the whole ceremony.
Oh, wow.
So we had the document.
Oh, how
And-
convenient.
yeah, exactly. And she said, I want all of it.
Wow.
So it was completely following her lead. And then she said, and Mom, you're in charge. Who could imagine such a story?
Wow.
So I got out my notes, and then the whole Korean community in Maine helped us. They had everything: the screen, the table,
Oh.
the pillars, the candy pillars, the outer garments. She had a hanbok made in Korea.
Oh, nice.
But all so we looked kudero, just the way it's supposed to be, and it was spectacular. And then my sister read the narration in English for the American guests so they could understand it.
Oh, that sounds so beautiful.
And that was the night before the Western ceremony was the next day.
Lovely.
It was really special.
I think that the power of love and the bond that you have between your daughter Yeonhee is just something legendary, really. And I'm curious if you wouldn't mind looking at one of the cameras and telling her exactly how you're feeling towards her.
Oh,
A little video letter.
okay. Hi, Yan. You are the daughter of my dreams. I can't imagine you being anyone but you. And you have been fulfilling as a daughter beyond my dreams. I love our ease of friendship. I love the way we discover and love Korea together. And I'm so delighted that you want to stay close to your parents and in a very Korean daughter way, to be right there near your parents. Thank you for all the beauty and richness and love you've brought into our lives.
When Anne met baby Yeonhee for the first time, she knew instantly that Yeonhee was meant to be her daughter. To Yeonhee, who didn't have a parent to call her own, Anne was like a gift from God. They've shared joy, sorrow, and heartaches for the past 28 years, and Anne and Yeonhee both feel blessed to have each other.
I imagine that being so busy with having written a number of books and illustrations, and it seems like you're constantly on the go. I'm curious what your future plans are.
Well, I have 3 books on the front of the stove now, front burner. It's called In the Shadow of the Sun, and it's a highly improbable adventure story about 2 American siblings, kind of similar to Perry and Yeonhee, a white American boy born into his family and a younger adoptee Korean sister, who are on a tour of North Korea with their father, who works in food relief for the Arirang mass game tour.
Yes.
And then things go terribly wrong, and these 2 siblings are trying to escape from North Korea. Highly improbable.
Interesting.
Yes.
Wow.
But as a result, I have gotten immersed in everything I can find on North Korea. What I think about it is what you said. It's all one people, but hugely challenging, because right now there are so many deeply wounded people, especially 200,000 in labor camps, that the challenge of reunification is enormous.
Yes.
It will take, I think, many decades, and maybe even a generation will have to pass before people can really become one people again. But they always are in their hearts. I hope will be published. It's at 7 editors right now.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
It's a serious book
sending
project.
Good energy. One of them will want to
Yes.
buy it. I have a picture book about called I'm New Here, about children who are immigrants to the U.S. and the project with Yeonhee. And then, so I feel like I'm kind of in my bicultural phase, my Korean and bicultural phase. After that, I want to do a family history project, a memoir. It's called Skin, the story of an American family. And I want to tell the story going way back in our family's history to slave owners. And I have a great-grandfather great-great-grandfather who set up a station on the Underground Railroad, an administrator of the Trail of Tears, all in one family, all the way to China and Korea. So I want to tell that story. Yeah, and we have an amazing, and it's such an American story of relationships across race. So I want to do that.
Well, it seems like being not only bicultural, but helping other people understand about any social injustices is really something in your DNA.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Both in my DNA and then in the extraordinary example my parents set. I know that we are all one human family. And anything that separates us and keeps us from seeing ourselves in the other is something I want to understand and help to melt away, to imagine our way back to deep connection with each other.
What does Korea mean to you?
It's my second homeland. It's the place that has woken me up again and again and again. It's a place of challenge. I can't be complacent here. I know too much. I have, it makes me want to express more and understand more. It's a place of gifts. It's a place of gifts, of being given gifts again and again and again. So I want to figure out how to give back.
And I feel like I've learned so much about one woman's passion, about sharing a culture that wasn't originally her own, who assimilated beautifully into the culture and is sharing that very special culture with the rest of the world. And I think that you're doing something very important for Koreans as well as people abroad. I hope that a lot of people do get a chance to see some of the work that you've done, because it's really stunning work that you've done.
Thank you so much.
And I'm sure that it's available, all over the place online. But really, to be a semi-ambassadress for Korea through your illustrations, I think, is something that Koreans are also very appreciative of. And I'm just so happy that you agreed to spend some time with me, telling me about your life. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you. This is such an honor for me and delightful.
Great. Thank you so much.
You've been with us here to see an amazing writer and illustrator, Anne Sibley O'Brien. I know that I've been impacted by her amazing passion for Korea and the very special stories that she has to share with the rest of the world through her art. I hope that you get a chance to see her more through her books and other media. And thank you again for being here with us on the interview. Take care.